Rehabilitation as a proposed solution to crime and criminality is something that can be touched upon. In connection with crime, with a person doing antisocial acts, one time tested solution is to place the person in a penitentiary, in a correctional facility, thus taking him or her away from society and removing the possibility, theoretically at least, of harm being done by way of that person, at least in society. And obviously, more drastic measures from there, including removing the person entirely from Earth, uh, have been in place since the dawn of human history. Rehabilitation, however, would emphasize the possibility of rehabilitating, for lack of a better term, of correcting the character of the given criminal, of the given criminally minded, should we say, individual, in hopes that he or she can be safely reintroduced into society, ideally. So instead of simply locking a person away like an animal in a cage for decades, perhaps for an entire lifetime, the idea of rehabilitation would say that something can be done concerning this given individual, such that he or she could eventually uh, be in society safely without being a threat to others. What can be said for and what can be said against this idea? Starting with for, it could be said, generally speaking, that the idea of, or the class of concepts under the broad name of education, right, which includes rehabilitation, is certainly an incredibly valuable class of concepts. Our whole kind of humanity is predicated on the possibility of moral, intellectual improvement. We're not stagnant in theory like stones. We're not set in stone like animals, more or less. We can change, we can improve. Our character can be molded. Our personality can be refined. Our ideas can change. So, in theory, the idea of taking a problematic person and smoothing him or her out, to so say, is a fine idea. It's the idea, again, at back of all educational efforts. We don't just take a baby, ideally, and say, go and be everything that you can be tomorrow. A long process of formation, a long process of education. So here, then, the question would be as to whether or not there is actually the possibility of rehabilitating a given person. Because if there was, probably anybody would grant, or just about anybody, excuse me, such as is not at least blinded by the desire for retribution, for revenge, probably anybody would grant that if you could take a given person, whatever they have done, and you could transform that person into somebody that is entirely against the acts of their antecedent version, somebody that is entirely ethically renewed, then that would be the ideal, right? That would be the dream. It would be crazy and criminal, really, to say otherwise. No, I want that person who did bad to always remain bad. I would rather have them remain bad, even if there was a choice. So the only question is not the desirability of rehabilitation. It is its practicality. It is its actual possibility. So what can be said concerning that possibility? One thing that could be said is that, or we could perhaps take a picture of a certain normative range of applicable psychological development and see how a given person, criminally minded person in question, may or may not differ from that norm. Within that norm, we see that an individual, uh, first of all, is always individual extrinsically as an object, right? Unless in the case of Siamese twins, where there's a single body, Otherwise, there's always an individual body. So I see the same body and I say, oh, that's Bob, that's Sally, that's Jim, that's Alice. But inwardly, things are not always so simple. Inwardly, a person can certainly vary tremendously. And it can sometimes be a far stretch to say that there even is a person inwardly. Something like multiple personality disorder is a well known case in point. Outwardly, that's the same person all the time. Inwardly, from his or her own point of view, it could be a completely different personality with its own memories, its own desires, its own fears, and so on, every 15 minutes, every few hours, whatever the case might be. So we see that given normative range concerning this question is that a person, should we say more broadly, an individuality forms such as has some degree of coherence, has some degree of consistency, such as has some degree of integration and relation to others, emotional relations with others. And consequently, if there is such a coherent individuality, then there arises the possibility, for example, of bad impulses being foot. There arises the possibility of stifling, unruly, antisocial appetites because there is a broader individuality at hand. Right? Inwardly, let's say I'm 18 years old, 20 years old, I am a given coherent person most of the time. And sometimes impulses arise, such as are at odds with my broader personality, my broader character, and I can then deliberate, should I do it, should I not do it? I can try to resist. And if then I screw up, I do something bad, I can feel bad. Punishment can help correct me. Consequences can help correct me. I can mind consequences in the first place. For example, I want to do this antisocial thing, maybe even something like speeding. However, I think of the consequences. I might get a ticket, so I don't do it. So those are all possibilities within that normative range. Now, if we're moving in a direction better than the norm, we would be moving probably, at least in this application, we would be moving in the direction of a greater unification of character, such as makes dastardly deeds, meaning poor acts, behavior, less and less appealing, less and less likely. So that a normative range, if a person is, for example, offered a certain sum to take an innocent person's life, it's going to be a hard no. Right? Some people might consider it a little bit more, others absolutely not. Right? But if we're on the better side of that normative range, there's no way. There's no amount of money you could pay me, goodness forbid, take the life of an innocent person. I'm just not going to do it. But there's other things that I would do. I might steal a little bit. I might lie for my advantage. And I might manipulate somebody to preserve my self-esteem or my power. Something like this. So if I'm moving in a good direction, I'm becoming more and more unified and set in good, to where everything else that's wrong and not good becomes just as unappealing as what is right now unappealing, such as taking the life of an innocent person. Get the idea? So if I'm moving in that direction, then again, there's less and less of a chance that I will do bad things. They're not appealing to me. They do not speak to me. I have no desire to steal. I have no desire to assault somebody and take their handbag or watch or whatever the case might be. No desire to scam somebody and so on. That's preferable, needless to say. However, I can be moving in the opposite direction where it becomes easier and easier for me to do bad deeds. And I'm less and less in tune with my relations with other people, with my interdependence with the whole, with society. And that's no good. However, there is a class of individualities such to which this hardly applies because there has been no fundamental, no essential underlying formation and unification of character. And consequently, there is no broader individuality such that can become better or become worse. It's not there in the first place. Extrinsically, there is a unity based on the anatomy. That is, again, Joe Schmo, Jane Doe, not to pick out those names. But inwardly, there is no such unity. There is no such continuity. There are simply appetites and impulses, perhaps related to some loosely assembled sense of egoism or sense of or self-concept. Perhaps not so relevant. Right? But the point being that there is yet no unification such that could constitute a self. We can say that that is the most problematic class of individualities, such as are often subject to and engage in criminality, and such the rehabilitation of which past a certain age might be, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Why? Because that stage of development is obviously necessary, say for a newborn. It is normal for the next few years. But past a certain young age, whatever that might be, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever it is, if no such self has formed, and that selfless structure or amalgamation of impulses and appetites and desires and such has hardened and set in stone, then there's really very little that can be done. There's nobody there to rehabilitate. There's nobody there to work with and to try to get them to favor the good, because there is no them, so to say. There is obviously some principle of individuation. There is it's an animal individuality and a sub-animal individuality. There is some psychology and such. But the self that is the product of integration has not arisen. And consequently, excuse me, there's not much there to do. And when an individual in that phase of psychological moral development wishes to do something, it will be done, regardless of its ethical desirability or lack thereof. The only thing that could stop me in that situation would be fear of pain. Fear of consequences might be even too much. I'm not able to think, I'm going to be in prison, I'm going to get a fine. That's too much. Fear of immediate pain can still speak to me. The desire for immediate pleasure can still speak to me. So this is probably the most problematic class. And while nobody should be entirely written off, and perhaps with tremendous expertise in a very close, personal, long-standing relationship between some or another counselor type, again, who is eminent in his or her field, and this kind of individuality, perhaps some progress could be made after decades. At least we don't want to say that it can't off the bat. And obviously we never know exactly who falls into that class. So it's not good to, if possible, write people off, at least from the personal perspective. Right? It can be said that practically from a societal perspective, there's reason to think that in question is a criminally inclined person that falls into this class, rehabilitation will not work. There's nobody there to rehabilitate, and unfortunately, isolation is the only possibility. And perhaps, again, maybe after decades of being away from society, some sort of coherence, some sort of integration might arise, but that's beyond, again, the scope in question, which is to protect the society and even protect the person from him or herself. Now, if, however, a person is not in this class and there is some self such that can favor the good or can favor the bad and can consider consequences, then rehabilitation, education becomes a possibility. And here, again, ideally, it would be based on a personal case by case evaluation of who is in question. There are some people that, especially young people, that could and would tremendously benefit from education and rehabilitation. And I have some self, I have the possibility of selfhood at 14, 15, 16. right? But it's just that I don't have guidance. I don't have a moral compass. Nobody taught me what to do. And I absolutely could tremendously benefit from having a role model, from having a counselor that works closely with me. That could be me. Then the ideal. If a person is beneath a certain age, to deprive them of the possibility of self-formation by taking away the possibility of education, of rehabilitation, that's not good from both a individual and a societal perspective. Um, if a person, on the other hand, is is well formed, right, and has a given arena of moral battle that they keep losing, that also gives the possibility of rehabilitation. For example, somebody is largely functioning but has at present an addiction. Somebody's largely functioning but cannot resist some or another sordid deed. Maybe can't help but steal, quote unquote, can't help but steal sometimes. Kleptomaniac might be the term. Something like this, then also directed um, help in that direction can become a possibility because there's a self here to work with. So, in brief summary, it was asked whether rehabilitation of criminally inclined individuals is or is not a desirable idea, setting aside the question of practicality, which can be evaluated in connection with things like the financial possibilities and such, just in theory, in an ideal state. What was offered was that whereas discreteness based on anatomy is always so, aside from Siamese twins, meaning there's always individuals. I see this person, that person, that person. The question is inwardly, to what extent am I unified character? If I am not at all unified, then impulses and appetites virtually immediately act through me, so to say, or I act in light of them. Not even that there is that an I, just the action is done in view of these possibilities for self satisfaction. I see something I want. Something is seen that is wanted. Assault is the way to get it. Assault shall be done. There's no question. There's no battle. There's no practical possibility of foreseeing long-term consequences. Oh, I'm going to be in jail after 2 years of being in court. None of that. In these cases, which are not as rare as one could hope, but also probably not as common as a very pessimistic view would take them to be. In these cases, rehabilitation is out of the question. There's no self there to rehabilitate. Isolation and removal from society, at least, would be the only possibility here of something functional coming about. In cases where there is a self, where there is a possibility for a self, such as with young people, such as with people who fight moral battles and fall sometimes, such as with people who at present have a faulty ideational system, an antisocial ideational system, meaning the incorrect ideas concerning other people, oneself, and such, then there is the possibility of working with such a person in principle, but the desire has to be there as in any other cases, but also the possibility of holding out different sticks, such as long-term consequences, which work when there is a self able to think about those things. So then rehabilitation becomes, again, in the case of young people, possibly an imperative, an ethical imperative, at least give the person a shot, and otherwise just on a case-by-case basis. And then there are cases of individuals that, again, are selves, are well integrated, are well formed, have particular battles, particular different arenas of weaknesses, and then certainly, especially with the person's desire, rehabilitation and self-rehabilitation is a distinct possibility. So those different variants can be considered. Thank you for listening.